they felt like superheroes. In 1989, 1990, if you're growing up in Detroit and you're between the ages of like 4 and 10, here's what was hot. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Bo Jackson, He-Man, and then you had the Detroit Pistons. Every single Piston had a nickname that made them sound like a superhero. You had Zeke, the Microwave, Buddha, the Worm, Spider. They were just these larger than life characters. It's a phenomenon.
You mentioned He-Man there. The Pistons were the masters of the NBA universe, I guess you could say, when it came to
well played
1989 and 1990.
Then you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So we're all getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you made the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 130. Thanks for joining me. Today, I'm happy to welcome a new friend of the show, Ryan Van Dusen, an archivist and curator of Detroit Pistons content and NBA history at large on YouTube. Search Ryan Van Dusen and join over 80,000 fans who already subscribe to his excellent channel. Today, we journey back to 1989 and discuss a key matchup between Central Division rivals, the Cleveland Cavaliers and Detroit Pistons. It's the final week of the regular season, and this contest had significant implications on postseason play. For added context, we cover a few incidents that happened earlier in the season that had an impact on this game, including a late January fight between the Cavs' Brad Daugherty and the Pistons' Bill Laimbeer, plus a second fight when Detroit's Isaiah Thomas mixed it up with Chicago's Bill Cartwright less than 2 weeks before the game we're covering today. This conversation was a lot of fun, and there are numerous audio drops to enjoy too. After the recap, we briefly discuss Ryan's YouTube channel. He's kindly created a playlist dedicated to this game. All relevant links are in the show notes. A quick tangent. After the main conversation, I thank some fans of my podcast who have reached out over the past 6 or so months, expressing appreciation for my show as it now nears 10 full years of existence. A few have generously supported the podcast monetarily. Thank you very much. I've also been happy to have 2 publishers send me review copies of new NBA books. Fans of Steve Kerr and Tyrone Muggsy Bogues will particularly enjoy this news. Show notes for this episode and access to a huge archive of past episodes are available at inallairness.com. Now, onto the show. I'm very happy to be joined by Ryan Van Dusen. Thanks for joining me, mate. How are you today?
Hey, not too bad, man. I appreciate you having me on.
We're going to be chatting about a great regular season matchup that had some important implications in the 1989 NBA regular season. It's the April 18 meeting, Detroit Pistons at Cleveland Cavaliers from Richfield Coliseum in Richfield, Ohio. This particular telecast is from the Past Sports cable network, and the commentators for the game are Fred McLeod and Tom Wilson, and they're joined by Marty Adler on the sidelines. Now, the coaches for the game today, we're talking about Chuck Daly of the Pistons and Lenny Wilkins of the Cavaliers. Anything in particular take your fancy there from the opening of the telecast?
This is part of the reason why I love this telecast. This was tailor-made for anyone who grew up in Metro Detroit or Michigan. Past Sports was our go-to in the 80s and 90s. So this is one of those classic Past Sports telecasts. PASS was an acronym, Program Sports System. I don't want to go too deep here, but when you think Pistons basketball, if you're a Pistons fan, you think George Blaha as the voice of the Pistons, who is still going to this day. But through a lot of the 90s and late 80s, we also had Fred McLeod, who some folks may know from his time in Cleveland. He was the main play-by-play for LeBron's championship in 2016. He's since passed away. When I think 90s basketball, like Pistons basketball, I'm thinking George Blaha. But right after that, I'm thinking Fred McLeod. So pretty nostalgic to hear his voice.
There's a great tidbit to accompany the game we're chatting about today. Detroit locals could pay $3 for a ticket to attend the Palace of Auburn Hills to watch the game on what the Detroit Free Press described as a giant screen television. And apparently 6,045 fans took up that opportunity to watch the Past Sports cable telecast.
I think they did it a couple of times when they made their finals runs in LA and in Portland. They used to open up the Palace. And this was year one of the Palace. So you had a Pistons fan base who was just getting their first taste of success. You had a brand new, at the time, state-of-the-art Palace of Auburn Hills. So I think people were excited to get out there, and they're looking for an excuse to get out there. And it's a sore spot because I'm still coming to terms with the fact the Palace is gone.
The demolition of the Palace, I believe, is on YouTube. You can actually watch it all go down. So
yeah, thanks for that.
Probably not great memories for you.
No, we could do literally a whole podcast on my feelings on the Palace. For those who are not stateside or those unfamiliar with Michigan, Auburn Hills was probably a solid 45 minutes north of Detroit. We were the Detroit Pistons, but we didn't play in Detroit. So it's nice to be back in the city. But on the other hand, gosh, there's so many great memories here in the Palace. And, it started this year. It started in '89.
The Richfield Coliseum, not that I've ever actually been to Cleveland, but I know that Richfield Coliseum was a short drive out of Cleveland itself as well. So some similarities there, I guess you'd say.
I don't have a draw to Cleveland basketball history being from Detroit, but just watching this game in particular, one thing that stuck out was the atmosphere was incredible. I was thoroughly impressed. And it's another thing that makes me nostalgic. A lot of the newer arenas are cavernous. I get it. They want new arenas to be an entertainment center. But I feel like Richfield was also just one of those classic, let's make a bowl for basketball, and it's going to be loud. It's going to trap all the noise, and it makes for such an awesome atmosphere for a game.
We'd be remiss not to mention that the Past Sports telecast opens with a montage of Pat Benatar's All Fired Up, which was set to highlights of the 1989 Detroit Pistons. This certainly gets one into the mood for the highly anticipated matchup we're about to discuss, Ryan.
It was amazing. One of the things that I love finding when I dive into these older games, I'm looking for the big moments. Any bad boys altercation isn't easy, click and upload. But also like these in-betweens, like these montages are just gold. I love them. And yeah, Pat Benatar, it's the right choice. It worked. It's 1989 in a nutshell. So yeah, I love that.
If our listener checks out your YouTube channel, you'll actually see the opening montage that we're talking about as well, because you've recently put that up on your channel, correct?
Yeah, actually, for this podcast, I pieced together a playlist, which hits on a few of my favorite moments from this contest. And I imagine we'll be talking about those in a few minutes.
Awesome. Let's quickly set the scene for the game itself, Ryan. These teams had a definite dislike for one another. It was in late January at Detroit. The Cavaliers, Brad Doherty, and the Pistons, Bill Laimbeer, were involved in a fight that then NBA Director of Operations, Rod Thorne, he described as, quote, our worst fight of the season by far. That's why we suspended both players for a game without pay, end quote.
57-41. We got a fight. Laimbeer and Doherty really going after it. Doherty's on the floor. Laimbeer on top of him, and so now our four Cavaliers on top of Bill Laimbeer.
And I can almost assure you those two are gone. And it's kind of sad because it's going to take some of the significance from this game.
Now, each player was fined $5,000. A Detroit Free Press article that I read while researching for our chat today said that fans who were watching the telecast at the Palace of Auburn Hills were shown footage of that brawl on the giant screen as a precursor to this game. Can you believe that?
That was our identity at the time. And a little side fun fact, what gets lost in history, and I'm biased, if there's anyone that's going to defend Bill Laimbeer to some regard, it's going to be me. That was actually, I stand to be corrected, the first time Bill Laimbeer had ever been suspended during his career. It could have been the first punch he threw in the late 80s because he had a consecutive games played streak, the longest active streak in the NBA at the time. That was the first time we saw Bill actually react and respond, and he connected. There's a nice slow motion run back of Brad taking one to the jaw, but it's with an asterisk because I'm pretty sure that Isaiah's holding one of Brad's arms from the back. So
it does appear that Isaiah is certainly holding on to Brad from behind to help Bill get a chance to open up with that right hand to Brad's face, to his jaw more specifically. So yeah, it was a pretty nasty little fracas there, but I found it interesting that they showed that footage ahead of the game itself, just for those that turned up to the Palace of Auburn Hills to try and get them into the mood for the game.
There is a piece of video that I've been looking for that I have not been able to find yet. It was between the Doherty punch and today's game. There was another contest where Rick Mahorn supposedly tagged Mark Price with an elbow to the head, which sounds brutal in every description I've read. It sounds like Price may have been concussed, and some have suggested it was a turning point to the Cavaliers season. I think Price may have had like a little downward trend in his playing. I don't remember if Mahorn was suspended, but I know he was fined. But it's this little piece of that 1989 season I've always been curious about, because it seemed to set both teams on opposite trajectories from there.
Yeah, that is fascinating to hear. Just as a background here for our listener, the Cavaliers entered this game having won 31 of their last 32 games at Richfield Coliseum, and that included 9 straight victories. The Pistons had won 6 of their past 7 games and 23 of their previous 26, so they were on a tear as well. Win in this game would clinch Detroit the league's best record, home court advantage throughout the playoffs, and a Central Division title. So there's lots to play for in this matchup for both teams.
Yeah, this was one of those things that I think sometimes gets lost in history for people who either weren't around at the time or were around, but just gets lost in the sauce. When we think 89, or at least when I do, Pistons, of course, because they took the ring, I think of maybe the Lakers. And like number 3 on that list, I usually think of Michael Jordan and the Bulls. And it's really easy to think that the Bulls and the Pistons had this collision course throughout the 1989 season. But in contrast, for most of that season, it was Cleveland. It was Cleveland and Detroit. And for a while, it was Cleveland by themselves. Cavs were 43-12 at one point, and the Pistons were 36-16. The Cavs were comfortably ahead of the field for a lot of the year. And for a while, it really seemed like it was almost inevitable that the Pistons and the Cavs would meet in the Eastern Conference Finals. But of course, things changed when MJ made his move.
Further to that, which is some great information in itself, the Cavaliers defeated Chicago 6 straight times during the regular season in 1989, and ultimately that would be flipped on its head when Chicago upset the higher-seeded Cavaliers in the first round playoffs, which ended with that fantastic, depending on who you ask, which side of the venture on, Michael Jordan buzzer beater to close out Game 5 to win the series at Cleveland. On the telecast that we're watching, Marty Adler was courtside prior to the tip-off, and just before he throws back to Fred and Tom for the call of the game, he briefly mentions that the Cavs fans booed him off the court. Did you pick up on that?
I mentioned boo birds earlier. They booed me off the floor. The game is on. Here's Fred and Tom.
Yeah, this game is discussed in Cameron Stough's The Franchise, which covers the 89 Pistons season. And they make a point, or Stout does, I should say, to mention just how, gosh, I'm trying to think of how to put this nicely. It was a rough crowd. Jack McCloskey, general manager for the Pistons, he was in the crowd that night. From the sounds of it, it wasn't a good time. I love that, to be honest, to a point, of course, but it ties back to Richfield. Just, it seems like, depending where you stand, either the best place to play or the worst place to play.
Vinnie Johnson started the game for the Pistons with Isaiah Thomas coming off the bench as Zeke was still recovering from a broken hand that he suffered at Chicago some 11 days earlier after he was involved in a fracas with the Bulls' Bill Cartwright.
Cartwright and Isaiah go at it in front of the Piston bench. Doug Collins is out there. Chuck Daly is out there. It has exploded here.
Isaiah was fined $5,000 and suspended 2 games for his role in the fight. He's still recovering from that broken hand and was coming off the bench.
Isaiah missed 2 games with a broken hand due to suspension for the fight with Cartwright. And this was something that would sort of linger with him throughout the playoffs. If you look closely, you'll see in that Bucks series, the semifinals, he was wearing a sort of protective glove. He didn't miss any time. He was coming off the bench in the regular season, but it was with a broken hand.
I hate to do comparisons between eras, but a lot of the time, if somebody breaks a hand, they're almost done for the season. Yet Zeke comes back, barely missed a game. It's quite a contrast for sure.
It's a tricky thing to consider because I don't know if I would call this a wise move on Isaiah's part. And not to mention, this was not an injury of happenstance. He either broke that hand on Bill Cartwright's jaw or he broke it on the floor after Cartwright threw him to the floor. So you could argue it was even irresponsible of Isaiah to end up with a broken hand. And maybe he felt obligated to play through it. But to be honest, that dude was tough. And there's a lot of people who say you have to be gravely ill to get someone off the court. And that was probably true with Isaiah. That dude played through everything. And it took literally a ruptured Achilles tendon to bring him down for the count in 1994.
To get into the game itself in the first quarter here, Detroit opened up on fire. The Cavs were trailing 8-0 and were forced to burn a 20-second timeout with just under 10 minutes left in the first quarter after there was 4 long Pistons jumpers, 2 from Lambier, 1 from Mark Aguirre, and 1 from Joe Dumars. And Joe Dumars is a name we're going to be saying a lot in this conversation. Just for context, Mark had recently been acquired, sorry about that pun there, from the Dallas Mavericks in a mid-February trade for Adrian Dantley and a future 1991 first-round pick who turned out to be LaBradford Smith, for those Jordan fans out there. These stats are, of course, courtesy of the great basketball reference. But anything in particular you'd like to mention there from the opening of this game and how quickly Detroit got out of the gate?
One thing you'll notice if you ever watched the 1989 Pistons and you see it here against the Cavs, that pick and pop, they abused it, bringing Bill Lambier out for a high screen and then having him float. And he would just sit probably right around that 20 to 22 foot range. He would crank mid-range jumpers all day. And it's something that, again, I think gets lost with Bill Lambier. He was a jerk and he knew he was a jerk and he accepted it. But as a result, people sometimes forget that he was actually a really good basketball player too. I would say he's probably among the first legitimate stretch fives or stretch fours, depending where he's playing. And it made him dangerous. Teams weren't necessarily accustomed to having to get out and put a hand up on someone from 6'11", 240 from 22 feet.
I'm 46 years old. My first recollections of Bill Lambier, in terms of watching him here in Australia on TV, was the 1990 NBA Finals. And I think it was Game 2. He made numerous three-point field goals in that game. I think he might have made 5 threes. I particularly thought, wow, for a guy of his size to have that sort of range back in this era was certainly something quite specific that I noticed at that time.
I even think for a while he shared the NBA Finals record for most three-pointers made in a single game. I think that tied him with Michael Cooper. For people who haven't seen Bill Lambier shoot, it's a trip because he doesn't really leave the floor. There's a slingshot motion. It doesn't look like it should go in, but it does. But it works.
Cleveland, by contrast, missed its first 6 field goal attempts and they fell behind 12-0 in just over 3 minutes of playing time. And the Cavs would remain scoreless from the field over 6 minutes whilst Detroit were firing on all cylinders. As you mentioned there, on the pick and roll near the top of the key, Lambier was putting on a clinic early on. And then on one of the Cleveland possessions, he actually stepped up to challenge the ball handler, Mark Price. And it seemed to me that Bill may have tripped Price on purpose. However, Fred McLeod called it, quote, inadvertent contact, end quote, on Bill Lambier. And Chuck Daly was livid. He was whistled for a technical foul quite quickly. And at this stage, the Cavs fans were in a near frenzy.
14-2. Pistons very intense. Good step out by Lambier, but a foul. There was contact and a technical foul for Dumars. Lambier had inadvertent contact, but there's no question he forced the issue.
When Price made the technical free throw, Detroit had the lead 14-3.
Here's the thing. I'll defend Bill Lambier to a point, but I try to find that line of neutrality, and he 100% knew what he was doing there. It's very consistent with what he did. There's some times where he'd just be like, I'm going to clothesline you, and I'm not going to hide it. But other times, he was a master of, if you're not paying close enough attention, it's going to look circumstantial and accidental. But I know for a fact that trip on Price, yeah, he knew what he was doing.
I think so too. And it's great to have you on the show today because I don't think in the history of this show I've had a pro-Detroit fan and a historian at that loves the Pistons as well to talk about this. So it's good to have this mixture between us today. This first quarter, Detroit made 9 of its first 11 shots, and they jumped out to a 20-3 lead. And after that rocky start, the Cavs began to work their way back into the game. It was also great to see Ron Harper running freely in transition. He hit a couple of driving layups, and it's always a joy to see a pre-ACL injured Ron Harper in the open court.
100%. And also a huge fan of dunk contests. Harper was into before his ACL injury. Great creativity, especially for the late 80s. He could do some things in the air. He was quick, got off the floor quickly. He was creative above the rim. It was a lot of fun to watch him, actually.
He had a fantastic career and obviously won a handful of championships as well. So one of the more unheralded players throughout the 1990s and into early 2000s. Late in the first quarter, Wayne Rollins, I'll call him Wayne for the moment, and Bill Laimbeer were getting physical with one another in the low post. And then Rollins would hit a tremendous running hook shot over Laimbeer. I'm really sorry about these puns, Ryan.
I love it.
The Pistons' lead would be reduced to 11. It was 28-17.
This is a pretty good segue. We just got done talking about Ron Harper, and then we got done talking about Tree. Part of the reason why I like this game is because, for better or worse, if you love the Pistons or hate the Pistons, there's so many quintessential Pistons moments in this game. You see the breadth of their actual talent and what they're capable of, but you also get like some of that classic bad boy stuff that you always hear about. It was Ron Harper coming down the paint. Rick Mahorn may have been baited into the air. He basically clotheslines Ron Harper. And then there's a camera cut, if you can see, but it sounds like Tree Rollins sneaks in a punch real quick.
Harper looking for a seam, creates one, forced the shot. Mahorn with a foul, look out as he pulls Harper down. They won't like that here. No harm done, I don't believe. And now Rollins reaches in with a punch. A technical foul will be assessed to Rollins. That was stupid.
Interestingly as well, I noted that the Pistons commentators had some banter about how much a supposed fine would be on Rollins versus what it would be had Mahorn been the culprit. The Cavaliers fans at the time were absolutely ropeable too, that they thought it was completely intentional from Mahorn, and they probably would have loved seeing Rollins just get that cheap shot in on Rick Mahorn.
So this is like one of those funny things. George Blaha, who's been involved with the Pistons since the mid-70s, he tends to find a line that's pretty close to neutrality. You know he's a Pistons play-by-play guy. Fred McLeod, he would lose that semblance of neutrality. He wouldn't hesitate. He's like, that's going to be worth about a $200 fine, which he was joking. I get that. But at the time, if you punch somebody, you weren't going to be out tens of thousands of dollars like you would be today. It was pocket change. And that's another one of the beautiful things here. People who did not actually watch Bad Boys Pistons basketball games because you're too young or you're not interested, whatever. There's this understanding that either the physicality that is spoken of in hindsight is exaggerated, is one assumption, or other people try to paint this idea that it was just nonstop football all the time. What you'd usually get is like this nice mix where if you watch a Pistons game from 89, you're going to get like 90% basketball, but every 8 to 10 minutes, you were liable to get something like this. Someone might get clotheslined, something ridiculous might happen. And in hindsight, since we know everyone came out of it okay, you can enjoy it. Like, that was pretty funny. That was pretty wild to see. It would have never been sustainable. There's a lot of comments I see, particularly on some of the videos I upload, is people who are yearning to go back to that era when you could punch someone and just get attacked and move on. I don't think that would have been sustainable. We remember Kermit and Rudy T, which happened in the 70s. Had the Bad Boys way of basketball continued onward, as it did with the Knicks for a little bit in the 90s, I think it probably would have gone sideways at some point.
That's beautifully said. Contrasting the eras for sure. Now, Laimbeer hit the technical free throw from Rollins' indiscretion, and then Harper made one of his 2 free throws, and Detroit had a 29-18 lead. And to close out the first quarter, Mark Price connected on a big 3-pointer to get the Cavs within 10 points. The glaring statistic after one quarter was the field goal percentage for each team. Detroit shot a stellar 58% from the floor, whereas Cleveland shot a lowly 30%. So after one quarter, Detroit held a 31-21 lead.
It sort of had a feel that first quarter, Detroit could taste it. Like when a boxer has their opponent on the ropes. There was home court advantage, which could have been clinched with a win. There was the division title that could be clinched with a win. This was their 60th win on the line. Sometimes you come out and there's this let up, or you come out the other way where it's like, you know what's at stake. And so let's come out and steamroll. And I think that's what you got in the first quarter from Detroit. I give credit to Cleveland for being able to withstand that punch, in part thanks to Mark Price. He's incredible. He's underrated. I think he's getting some love now looking back, but what an underrated point guard.
You don't need to tell me twice that he's underrated. He's certainly one of the great players from the 1980s and 1990s who doesn't get his fair due that I don't believe. It was a good fight back from Cleveland. They were down 20-3, and then the first quarter score was 31-21. So they certainly fought their way back into it. Into the second quarter, the tempo of the game definitely picked up. Bill Laimbeer opened a scoring for the Pistons, and he hit a three-pointer from near the top of the key. To that stage, he had 12 points in the game. And then after a couple of quick scores from Cleveland, the margin dipped below 10 points for the first time since the game's opening minutes. However, that didn't last long, as the ever-active Dennis Rodman scored a couple of times, and he began to make his presence known on the offensive glass. This is a really interesting moment in Rodman's career. He would win the Defensive Player of the Year the following 2 seasons. You could just sense that his importance to this Pistons team was really coming into focus, mate.
What's so fun about watching 1980s Dennis Rodman is he's such a ball of energy. He's a jack of all trades. Like, the minute he comes off the bench, he's living and dying with every single possession. It's a beautiful watch. This is before he got caught up into other sorts of shenanigans. It seemed like after Rick Mahorn, there was like a bad boys void that it seemed like Rodman felt obligated to fill. He wasn't really involved in much hijinks at this point. You were just getting someone who was running 90 miles per hour, filling the lanes, coming over on help side, diving for loose balls 5 minutes into the first quarter. It's so fun to watch him play. One of the clips I wanted to share that's up on my channel, one of Rodman's defensive tendencies that I've always loved is he was a 1-foot jumper in the half court. When he would come over from help side, most centers or power forwards or shot blocking threats, they're planting their feet to establish themselves and extending that way. Gosh, I don't know how to compare it. I don't know if it's like a volleyball gather, but one of those goaltends was like a classic Rodman help side block that I think he may have gotten it on the way down a little bit. But it's always been so fascinating that he's able to gather himself probably within 3 or 4 steps for a 1-footed takeoff in traffic on the help side. Just one of those things that, it's so unique.
The first of the 2 goaltends was the one that was closest to being a legal block. It just may have been on its downward flight, and they do show a replay from the opposite baseline. It was a tremendous attempt, and his athleticism was almost unparalleled at that stage as well. I've got on my notes here that the Cavs' Darnell Valentine would then score on a driving layup in transition. That certainly got the crowd involved, and Chuck Daly was actually forced to burn a timeout because he had Rick Mahorn, Bill Laimbeer, and Joe Dumars all sitting in front of the scorer's table waiting for a few possessions before they could actually sub back into the game. And actually at that time, there was a minor incident with Craig Elo, Isaiah Thomas, and Bill Laimbeer just after that timeout was called.
They talk about that in the franchise because I think that was mostly off camera. That was the vibe. People were on edge, and if things are ever going to get testy, it's going to be when Detroit comes to town at this point in time.
This all happened with just over 5 minutes left in the half, and the Cavaliers had reduced the margin to just 4 points. It was 45-41. They'd fought back valiantly. Returning from the ad break, we see a sign that was held up in the crowd that read, "Laimbeer is a stiff." Fred McLeod then said,
"Now, how can they say that about a former Cavalier, huh?"
Speaking of which, that's more footage I'd be interested in digging up at some point. Bill Laimbeer, Cleveland Cavalier footage. There's bits and pieces out there. It's so fun to go back in time to find Bill before he realized what he could be, which is one of the most hated men in NBA history. There was a time where he was just someone out there grinding and trying to find a place in the league, and that was in Cleveland. It's one of the funny things about Bill Laimbeer. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the ramifications of it. He knew he would be hated for what he did because he did things that warranted being hated, but he embraced it. I have not had a conversation with Bill about this, but I would imagine when he saw signs like that, he likely found it amusing. And some people, they use that as motivation to get out there and do what they do.
Just in a brief segue now, we're talking about Bill and his former team, the Cavaliers. In his fourth season as an assistant coach with the Philadelphia 76ers, Chuck Daly then became the third coach of the Cavaliers during the 1982 NBA season. Now, these are all stats I've obtained via basketballreference.com, which is amazing. Don Delaney was relieved of his duties after a 4-11 start. He was then replaced by Bob Kloppenberg, who was given the heave-ho after 0-3 start, and then that led to Daly being chucked in as head man. And he went 9-32 before he was replaced by Bill Musselman, who in turn went 2-21. Talk about a tumultuous season for the 1982 Cavaliers. They went through 4 head coaches, but more interesting is the fact that Chuck briefly coached both James Edwards and Bill Laimbeer with the Cavaliers, and obviously 2 key members of the Pistons lineup during this era of Detroit basketball that we're covering today, mate.
It's such an obscure time in Cleveland basketball history, and it's a blind spot for me too. Those are the types of moments that I actually enjoy learning about. I would like to go back and delve into like the Chuck Daly Cleveland Cavaliers partial year. Now, I've heard a lot about Ted Stepien from the time. Wasn't he just trading away draft picks every single year? They had to introduce a rule that would limit the number of draft picks you can trade away in consecutive years, because it seems like he was just running Cleveland into the ground. And I believe Chuck and Bill came through right in the middle of that. I would imagine once Chuck came to Detroit, his knowledge of what Bill Laimbeer brought to the table, likely in general manager Jack McCloskey to make that move.
Now, just to close out the first half here, I've got in my notes, Mark Price came off multiple screens. He dished the ball to Ron Harper on the baseline. Harp connected on the mid-range jumper, and that reduced the deficit to just 4 points again. It was 51-47. And then Price hit a really tough runner in the lane that brought the score to within just 2 points. However, as a precursor to how the third quarter would unfold, Joe Dumars answered right back with a runner of his own from near the left elbow, and that brought the lead back out to 4 points. And Joe D also hit a long 3 just after time expired to end that first half. To finish the first half, Cleveland had outscored Detroit 28-22, and it was a 53-49 lead for Detroit.
I've kind of wondered about that shot after the whistle that didn't count. Sometimes it just feels good to see the ball go in the hoop, even if it doesn't count. And knowing what's coming in the third quarter, you kind of feel like it already started right before half. It's a perfect segue, perfect amount of foreshadowing for what Joe's up to in the third.
1 second to play, and Dumars cannot get it off in time. Take away the bucket.
It actually was a perfect swish too, just to add insult to injury as far as Cleveland would be concerned, as that third quarter would come to be. A couple of quick stats. Detroit shot 59% from the field in the first half to Cleveland's 41%. The biggest disparity that was pointed out by the commentators was in the free throws. Pistons were only 4 of 6 from the free throw line, whilst the Cavaliers lived at the line in that first half, 16 of 17, which effectively kept them in the game to that stage. And Laimbeer had led all scorers at the half with 14 points, and Ron Harper was the leading scorer for Cleveland with 11.
It almost reminded me of Phil Jackson. I think mostly in the Lakers years, when you'd be in the middle of a playoff series and he would find the time to complain about the free throw disparity. And sometimes it's valid. In this particular game, it's because everything was done along the perimeter. The Pistons, they were just picking and popping Bill Laimbeer all night. So it only makes sense if you're not attacking the basket. Like, there's going to be that disparity. But on the plus side, the Pistons were hitting. So all's well that ends well.
Cleveland's Mike Sanders in the low post and Detroit's Bill Laimbeer near the top of the key opened the scoring for each team in that third period. However, as we've been alluding to, the main story would be the Pistons' Joe Dumars.
Dumars with a floater, yes.
He tied a regular season team record with 24 points in the third quarter.
Kicks it back out for Dumars, a 3. Yes, he sticks it. Joey D with 17 points.
That included a streak of 17 straight points.
3-on-2. Dumars takes it inside. He lays in. He is fouled. He goes to the line.
He made 10 of 14 field goals, including 3 3-point makes.
Harper on a switch picks up Dumars, who lets it fly, and he hits it again for 3. Dumars with 23 points. He's at 11 in this quarter.
It was really great, actually, to hear Fred and Tom on commentary just reacting to the crazy amount of makes that Dumars had.
Dumars again. Good again.
Boy, does he feel it tonight or what?
What a display. 25 for Dumars.
If you're looking to define what it means to be in the zone. I feel like this would be one of those quintessential 80s examples. Of course, now I would probably just pull up Klay Thompson's 37-point quarter he had back in 2015. Gosh, you can just see Joe Dumars' approach to the game change, where suddenly you feel like you have the license to seek things out that you otherwise would defer or you'd let the game come to you. There's one point where he misses a runner and then he follows it with a left-handed tip-in off the glass, which was a completely un-Joe Dumars type of play.
Joey missed, tipped it in! Dumars again! He's going bananas!
It's almost like he was ordained to have the quarter he did.
70-57, Pistons by 13, thanks to the heroics of that guy. Dumars again. He hit it again! I don't believe it! 29 for Dumars.
This is an Isaiah Thomas quarter right now, Fred.
To be biased here, this is my all-time favorite Piston.
Two-man game, Dumars and Lambier. Valentine stays with him. Joey readjusts. He hit it again. What can you say about this guy? He's got 31 points, and some of these shots have been very difficult.
So this is one of my favorite moments in Pistons history, to be honest. It's so fun to watch Joe Dumars cook.
Isaiah and Price dueling. Dumars off the pick. Two more.
Oh, my.
Ring it up. 33 for Dumars. He's 2 away from his career high, and we still have a fourth quarter to play.
It was incredible.
He was just hitting on all matter of shots.
Dumars tries a three again. I don't believe it. I'm watching it, and I don't believe it. 36 for Dumars, a career high. 24 points in the quarter.
After 3 quarters, Detroit held an 83-72 lead, and it was around this point where Fred McLeod was starting to say that the champagne in the locker room was starting to get chilled.
When I watched that run from Dumars, it's the perfect I'm on fire in 1989 run. There's a barrage of mid-range jumpers. There's a few three-pointers mixed in there. And I can't help but think, like, if Joe Dumars was that hot in 2022, I feel like a lot of those mid-ranges, he's probably just taken a couple steps back. I wouldn't be surprised if he would have touched 30 if he had that sort of performance in today's game.
The rest of the Pistons scored 6 points combined in that third quarter. 2s from Lambier, Aguirre, and Thomas. And the Pistons outscored Cleveland 30-23. Cleveland's highest scoring output was in this fourth quarter. Unfortunately for them, it was also that way for the Pistons. Detroit actually increased their lead by racking up 35 points in the fourth to Cleveland's 30. It's worth noting that Mark Price left the game for good during this fourth quarter with a muscle strain in his groin, and he missed the Cavaliers' last 2 regular season games and also would miss the opening game of that classic first-round playoff series versus the Bulls. A sour note there for the Cavs on top of the defeat. The final score would be 118-102, and the Pistons and Cavaliers would split their season series at 3 games apiece. Just reflecting back on that fourth quarter, mate, is there anything in particular you'd like to point out?
2 really small details. Number 1, this would probably only be understood with anyone who once owned the NBA Jam Session VHS. There's one music video on that VHS that is mostly, I think, pass-centric. It's about point guards. And there's this one low-angle replay of Isaiah Thomas flinging this bullet over Mark Price's shoulder to the opposite block for a reverse layup. That pass was about 3 minutes into the fourth quarter. You only see it once from the press angle, and that's it. But I recognize it immediately. I've been looking for it for years. I always want to see what it looked like in live action. So if you blink, it's gone. It's classic Isaiah. He was liable to fire a bullet. He's also liable sometimes to fire that bullet into the crowd every now and again. A little overzealous, but when it worked, it was beautiful. That was number 1. Number 2 comes with about 3 minutes left. If you look at the box score from that night, Brad Daugherty was struggling. He had a breakaway dunk toward the end, which makes his numbers look a little bit better in hindsight. With about 3 minutes left, Bill Lambier is guarding Brad Daugherty in the post. Daugherty hits him with a little shimmy shake, mid-yell hook. On the broadcast, you can hear Bill yell.
You can hear a little bit. Daugherty with a bucket.
Ricky Mahorn yelled, "Hey, he made one."
It's perfect, and it's classic Bill Lambier, for better or worse. If you hate Bill, it just makes you hate him more. But it's twisting a knife at that point. I think Doherty was probably 4 for 11 at that point. The icing on the cake for Pistons.
I had to rewind it to then watch it again and look at Bill's mouth to make sure it was him that said it. One of the commentators did say it was Ricky Mahorn. For Detroit, Joe Dumars had 42 points, which was a then career high. He also added 11 assists, 4 rebounds, and 3 steals, so a tremendous game all around. Lambier ended up with 18 points and 8 rebounds. Isaiah had 17 points and 8 assists, and Rick Mahorn had 11 boards. Mark Price led Cleveland with 21 points and 8 assists. Hot Rod Williams had 14 points and 7 boards. Darnell Valentine had a good game. He had 14 points and 5 assists. And Brad Doherty, he finished up with 13 points and 10 rebounds. Ron Harper finished with 11 points. Detroit claimed their second straight division title. They got the home court advantage throughout the NBA playoffs and also brought up their 60th win of the season, as you alluded to earlier as well.
The funny thing that sticks out to me on the box score is Joe Dumars racking up 11 assists. I don't know if I was just like keyed in and so mesmerized by his third quarter, but I can't remember him distributing the ball this game. I don't know. He ended up with 11 assists. That's wild, number one. Number two, Isaiah still has this broken hand 11 days, you said, after the fight with Bill Cartwright. The fact he's out here scoring 17 points, 8 assists, 2 turnovers off the bench. Joe Dumars has always been my favorite Piston. There was a time where I was like, yeah, Isaiah's great. Sure. Kind of wrote him off. But the more I look back and the more I watch Isaiah game by game, the more respect I gain for him as a player. I know that he's polarizing from a personality standpoint, and particularly from his decision in 1991 at the conclusion of the Eastern Conference Finals. But strictly from a player standpoint, gosh, he's a warrior. It's wild. One of my favorite parts about this broadcast is the past sports cameras following the Pistons into the Richfield locker room. It's so fascinating whenever you can get a glance at the NBA experience looked like for road teams in times gone by. It looks like a high school locker room. I've literally gotten ready for games and locker rooms that would put that Richfield storage closet to shame. But on the same hand, it's actually kind of like this little slightly intimate moment, being able to see the Pistons coming in and celebrating their second consecutive division title.
You're looking live at the locker room as the Pistons come in. Michael Williams, James Edwards, Dennis Rodman, John Long, Mike Abdenauer, John Sally. They're loving it as the Pistons guarantee themselves home court advantage throughout the playoffs. And Jack McCloskey there joining the shot. As you get a look at it, McCloskey making that key deal, acquiring Aguirre for Dantley.
There's a Fred McLeod interview with Joe Dumars toward the end. It's always fun to see Joe get his due.
You're on live back in Detroit. How big did that basket look to you tonight? Once I got up in the air and just located the goal, I felt like it was going in. Have you ever had any kind of game like this, even in the gym by yourself, where it seemed like every shot you put up, it was going to go in? I scored a lot in college, so I had a lot of nights like this where everything felt like it was going in. But by far, this is best scoring night I've had in the NBA.
This was just the 4th loss at home for Cleveland. Their last 2 regular season games would be on the road, and they finished the season stellar 37-4 at home, which was a then tie for the 3rd best home record in NBA history in 1989. Joe Dumars' 30 points in the second half set a then team record, and with that victory, as we said, Detroit clinched the NBA's best record. They'd end up with a 63-19 mark. Joe Dumars' career high, for those who are wondering, is 45 points. It was in a game at Golden State from March of 1992. As our listener would most likely know, Ryan, Detroit would steamroll through the playoffs en route to the franchise's first NBA championship since they relocated some 4 decades earlier from Fort Wayne. The next day's Detroit Free Press, the headline read, quote, "It's a cinch, Pistons clinch," end quote. They were trying to keep a lid on things, looking forward to the 1989 playoffs and particularly those NBA finals, which they'd win for the first time since, as we said, they'd moved from Fort Wayne.
It's interesting to watch this transformation that sort of happens with the Pistons, probably dating back to like 87 or 88. The Bad Boys moniker was shot into the stratosphere by the NBA. They used to release these VHS yearbooks for certain prominent teams. They made them for the Bulls into the 90s. One was Untouchables. The 1988 Pistons VHS video yearbook was called Bad Boys. I wouldn't call it turmoil, but there was kind of a dispute within the team of, all right, they're labeling us as though we're out here starting fights every single game. Sometimes they were, but they kind of had to make this decision. Like, do they run away from the Bad Boys moniker or do they embrace it? And I think 1989 is when you got a team that just went all in and said, let's embrace it. And the organization did too. By the time they reached the Eastern Conference Final, there'd be times before the game where they'd have someone run across the court with a giant flag, not with the Pistons logo, but with the skull and crossbones of the Bad Boys, which you probably would never get today. That would never fly. All due respect to 2022. There's wonderful basketball being played and everything, but they're not going to let you walk out there with an unofficial secondary logo of skull and crossbones.
That's the black flag, isn't it, that they had with the white text and image?
Yeah. In Detroit at the time, that was a phenomenon. I am 38 years old. I was only like 6 at the time. So a lot of what I know about the Pistons has come in hindsight. What I knew about the Pistons at the time was they felt like superheroes. In 1989, 1990, if you're growing up in Detroit and you're between the ages of like 4 and 10, here's what was hot. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Bo Jackson, who played football in the NFL and Major League Baseball at the same time, He-Man. And then you had the Detroit Pistons. Every single Piston had a nickname that made them sound like a superhero. You had Zeke, you had the Microwave, you had Buddha, you had the Worm, you had Spider. They were just these larger than life characters. It's a phenomenon.
You mentioned He-Man there. The Pistons were the masters of the NBA universe, I guess you could say, when it came to
well played
1989 and 1990.
2004 was incredible as well when the Pistons won. But I think it's going to be hard to match that first time, especially with the hype of the Bad Boys. It felt like we were doing it our way to some degree. And of course, it comes with its flaws, as we would see in those Pistons Bulls here time to time. But what a wonderful time to grow up. It's pretty fun to look back to. I want to go back to the importance of this particular game and how everything had culminated here. If the ball bounces a different way here or there, you talked about the Cavaliers. You say they've lost 4 home games all year.
37-4 they were.
They were probably at the time closing in on matching the all-time mark. I'd have to see what the 86 Celtics were at home. But there was a time where the Cavaliers were chasing history in some regards. And to go from that, where they probably had a 5-game lead in the Central in mid-February, they're running away, possibly chasing the best record in the NBA, and then having to settle for the 3rd seed, which set them up with Chicago in the first round. What a gut punch. Growing up, I used to watch that Michael Jordan shot over Craig Elo. And by the way, here's where I stood on the Bulls when I was younger. When I was 6 or 7, I was so sure after Michael Jordan hit that game-winning shot, I was so sure that he jump kicked Craig Elo. I was convinced that he karate kicked him to the ground, and I stood by it. No, of course, it's ridiculous. It didn't happen, but
Elo is on his knees on the sideline afterwards, so it does make sense.
And that's how my brain worked at the time. If you're raised in Detroit, you were also raised to hate Chicago and the Bulls for no reason. It made no sense. So there's that. But I saw Cleveland as fodder as I was coming up. Like, yeah, it's the Cavs. Why is that Jordan shot so great anyway? It's just the Cavaliers. Those 89 Cavs were not just the Cavaliers. Like, this was a team that won 57 games and very well could have been a number 1 seed in the East if a few things shook out differently. Maybe if the Pistons don't trade Adrian Dantley. So that's kind of what set up their huge tear. The Pistons finished the season 27-3 run, which took them from being 5 games back to winning the Central by 6 games. But let's say that trade doesn't happen. Let's say Adrian Dantley and Chuck Daly have a falling out and things just get worse. Kind of like Otis Thorpe and Doug Collins in the mid-90s. If Cleveland grabs that 1 seed, who knows what happens? And if it's the Pistons who are stuck with Chicago in the first round, gosh, I think all bets are off. I don't know if Detroit would have been ready for Chicago at that point. The fact that Detroit got to watch Michael Jordan make his run through Cleveland and then New York in the second round that Chicago saw. Being able to watch what was happening in Chicago, I think, should have given Detroit a heads up. And even then, they got punched in the face in that Eastern Conference Finals. Lost game 1, 94-88. There's only so much you can do to prepare for Michael Jordan. But it's just so interesting, like, there's some butterfly effect stuff happening here. The Cavaliers, I don't think, ever fully recover from, number one, losing the Central to Detroit, and number two, losing to Chicago in the first round. I think it's really important for people who look back to realize that that Jordan shot, that was a 6 seed, taking out a team that had won 57 games. It's pretty amazing in hindsight.
Absolutely was, and it certainly stunted the Cavaliers franchise for quite a few years to come, unfortunately, as far as Cleveland were concerned, because they were such a great team in the late 80s into the early 1990s, and again would meet the Bulls in multiple playoff rounds as well. With the exception of the Chicago Bulls, who did take 2 games from the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals. Detroit swept the opponents. They went 3-0 over Boston in round 1. They swept the Bucks 4-0 in the Eastern Conference semis and took out the defending back-to-back champion LA Lakers 4-0 as well in the 1989 NBA Finals. So an incredible run there for Detroit to get the first of their 2 straight NBA titles. I love talking about old games. So to be able to dissect this and you provide the video footage for us has been really great. I've followed your YouTube channel for some time now. You've got over 80,000 subscribers as we record this, which is fantastic. What can fans expect to see on your channel and what's your main focus?
I started about 10 years ago, and the main focus is just on the historic. It can be big moments in NBA history. I'm a huge fan of dunk contests. So I have a rundown of, I think, every single individual dunk contest performance until 2018. But it can also be literally any small moment that I feel is notable in NBA history. I feel like everything from 2007 onward has had an online life. It's been on the internet. But that just means everything before the mid-2000s may be unaccounted for, with the exception of the biggest moments. We know Kareem's skyhook will be there. We know that Larry Bird's steal will be there. That's always on YouTube. My goal is to find the undercurrent. The more obscure, sometimes the better. If there's a player that you heard about and you want to see what his game looked like, I like the idea of you be able to type his name into a search and you're going to get something, is my hope. It might be 2 minutes of Mark Macon with the Pistons or Paul McKeskey highlights. I feel like those things matter. I think it's important that we document them. So that's been my goal from day one. And there's a heavy lean toward the Pistons because I'm a Pistons fan. So a lot of my work comes out of Detroit, but by no means am I limited to it.
I'll include links to your YouTube channel. So I definitely suggest that our listener check out your great channel there and subscribe for what it's worth. Do you want to add anything else further before we put a bow on the episode, mate?
I appreciate you having me on. It was so much fun. I'll literally talk about anything Pistons related. It was a blast to go back. Appreciate you having me on.
Love to get you back on at some stage. We'll work out another Pistons game to chat about, and we can do this all again. Thanks very much for being a part of the show today.
Hey, man. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. Tap the microphone icon on my website to send me a voicemail. You can suggest discussion topics or guests you'd like to hear conversations with. Thanks to the following fans who reached out recently, in no particular order: Chad, Stephen, Tony, Balzini, John, Matt, Leon, Tara, Ben, Jack, SB, T, and George. Jack, please contact me again, mate. Your return email address was incomplete, so I guessed the missing letters, but another Jack replied, so please reach back out and I will reply to your first message. Last but not least, many thanks to Scott Howard Cooper for sending me a copy of his 2021 book, Steve Kerr, A Life, by William Morrow Publisher. And also thanks to Chelsea at Triumph Books for sending Muggsy, My Life from a Kid in the Projects, to the godfather of small ball. Worldwide, the show has 194 ratings on Apple Podcasts, with an average of 4.9 stars, with 100 reviews across all providers. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Your word-of-mouth recommendations are truly worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my free NBA history newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming episodes, future guests to appear on the show, and more. Sign up via my website or simply email me, inallairness@gmail.com. You can follow my show in various ways. Search In All Airness, 3 words, on your listening app of choice. The show is available on most platforms. Check the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with a great range of guests. My Instagram and Twitter handle is @inallairness. Search In All Airness on YouTube and Facebook too. Join me next time for another edition of the show.